Continuing our discussion of industrialization, the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 had first demonstrated the battlefield effects of the Industrial Revolution, but the American Civil War of 1861 to 65 is where these effects became dominant. In the Civil War, the mismatch between obsolete Napoleonic-era tactics and modern weaponry combined to produce incredible numbers of battlefield casualties. Unfortunately, among the military planning staffs of Europe, the carnage of the American Civil War was largely seen as an American phenomenon, largely irrelevant to European considerations. This, of course, was spectacularly wrong, as the trench warfare of World War I conclusively demonstrated. In fact, towards the end of the American Civil War, American battlefields were increasingly taking on the character of World War I fortifications, with elaborate trench networks and earthworks, such as those seen at Fort Mahone in Virginia, also known as Fort Damnation. This makes the Civil War a so-called transitional war, bridging the era of Napoleon with the fully industrialized total war of World War I. During the American Civil War, modern bullets, repeating rifles, breech-loaded modern artillery, aerial observation balloons, early machine guns, ironclad ships, and even primitive submarines had all been introduced, but in many cases these were not yet prevalent or common. This makes a critical difference. As historian Gwen Dyer argued, the Civil War may have happened just in the nick of time, because if it comes even 10 years later, all of these weapons, instead of being rare, are everywhere, and the conflict then takes on the character of World War I, a trench warfare defensive stalemate with no clear end or resolution and unimaginable consequences. In Japan, the arrival of an industrial power also had unimaginable consequences. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy had visited Japan with a squadron of warships, then returned a year later with an even larger fleet. Perry had been ordered by U.S. Millard Fillmore to open Japan to U.S. trade, and Perry's so-called gunboat diplomacy, while successful at intimidating the Japanese into signing a trade deal, also triggered a series of events that had earth-shaking consequences. After gaining a Japanese trade concession, the U.S. then pressured Japan into signing other trade deals, the so-called unequal treaties, with France, Britain, the Netherlands, and Russia. Japan was facing foreign domination similar to the so-called scramble for concessions in China, where European colonialists were carving up the coastline of China into extraterritorial concessions in which the Europeans were sovereign. As one feudal lord of the ruling Japanese Tokugawa shogunate said, "If we take the initiative, we can dominate. If we do not, we will be dominated." Japan was facing the choice between being colonized or becoming a colonizing country, and it chose the latter. This is the beginning of the Meiji Restoration, which ended the Tokugawa shogunate that had ruled Japan during the Edo period, which had lasted for more than 250 years. The Edo period had been characterized by remarkable stability, now ended with the restoration of Imperial Japan and the Emperor, and Japan's struggles to emerge as a new nation. The Meiji Restoration also modernized and industrialized Japan. With the advice of thousands of foreign experts, Japan rapidly built a centralized government with a Western-style bureaucracy, a market economy, universal education, and robust foreign diplomacy. For a colonizing country, of course, a strong military is essential, so Japan hired the best. British experts to advise and train a modern navy, German advisors to train a modern army. No one had industrialized more quickly and thoroughly than the United States, so American experts and others advised on how to build Japanese industry and maximize its efficiency. Efficiency in particular is a critical concern for Japan due to its geography. It is a relatively small series of volcanic islands off the coast of Asia with relatively little in the way of natural resources of its own. How to secure and maintain control of natural resources in quantities sufficient to feed Japanese industry will thus be a critical motivation in Japan's expansion as an imperial and colonizing power in the Pacific, and especially in its repeated and nearly continuous wars of conquest in Manchuria and China on the Asian mainland. Of course, there was dissent and conflict and resistance, but the last gasp of resistance by the traditional samurai against the Meiji government, the Satsuma Rebellion, ended with the samurai forces being crushed by a now modernized Japanese army using Western-style weapons against samurai armed with traditional edged weapons, bows, and spears. Japan's internal armed conflict was over, but its foreign conflicts were just beginning. Japan was concerned about Korea's close proximity to Japan and its vulnerability to foreign occupation, which could put a foreign colonizer on Japan's doorstep. Japan also wanted a foothold on the Asian mainland to serve as a base for further expansion. So, in 1894, Japan launched the first Sino-Japanese War by successfully attacking Chinese forces in Korea. China had long treated Korea as a tributary, as a vassal state, and the loss of Korea to Japan was a heavy loss to the ruling Qing dynasty in China. In fact, the loss of Korea began a series of events that ultimately culminated in the end of the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty of imperial China. In the treaty that concluded the war, China was forced to give up Korea, Formosa, which is modern-day Taiwan, the Penghu Islands, and the Liaodong Peninsula on the mainland. China was also forced to pay indemnities to Japan and open China to Japanese trade. Japan hadn't been a colonizing country for very long, but it had certainly learned quickly. The successful war also brought Japan into contact and conflict with the other colonizing country on the Asian mainland, the Russian Empire. Russia had been expanding into China's northern Manchurian provinces and encroaching on Korea, and went so far as to occupy the Liaodong Peninsula and build a port there, Port Arthur. This peninsula, you'll remember, had been ceded to Japan by China in the treaty that ended the First Sino-Japanese War, but an alliance of Russia, Germany, and France had forced Japan to evacuate the peninsula, and now it had been turned into a Russian base in close proximity to Japan. After Russia rejected Japanese offers of a compromise, Japan chose instead to go to war. This was the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War, which should have been one of the most lopsided conflicts in history. The mighty Russian Empire, a continental powerhouse spanning 11 time zones, versus Japan, a small series of volcanic islands with few natural resources of its own. Yet Japan opened the war with a surprise naval attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur that heavily damaged, but did not totally destroy the Russian fleet. Japan then invaded Russian-held Manchuria in order to attack Russian forces from the land side. After taking Port Arthur, Japan was able to use shore-based artillery to wipe out the remainder of the Russian Pacific Fleet. Russian forces sent to recapture Port Arthur were driven back. At the same time, Russia redeployed its Baltic Sea fleet to the Pacific, a voyage of more than 15,000 miles, lasting 7 months, only to arrive and find that Port Arthur had already fallen to the Japanese. Then, trying to reach the friendly Russian port of Vladivostok, the Russian fleet was intercepted by the Japanese fleet in the Straits of Tsushima and virtually annihilated, with only 3 Russian vessels escaping. The war was concluded with the Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. Russia evacuated Manchuria, and Japan became the dominant power in East Asia. However, Roosevelt sided with Russia's refusal to pay an indemnity, and this led to widespread Japanese resentment and bitterness towards the U.S., who Japan felt had cheated it out of the fruits of its victory. This resentment would be compounded in 1921 by the Washington Naval Treaty, which sought to suppress Japanese ambitions in the Pacific and provoked Japanese war planners to begin planning for war against the United States in the Pacific, 20 years before Pearl Harbor. The collapse of the Russian position in the Far East had other consequences. Russian desires to remain relevant as an imperial power would eventually lead them to intervene in the Balkans, the last area where Russian influence might still have credibility. In the Balkans, Serbia was attempting to wrest control of the Balkans away from Austria-Hungary and put together Greater Serbia, following a course not much different from the wars of German unification that had united the German Empire in 1871. Russia had intervened on the side of Serbia in the First Balkan War of 1912, then the Second Balkan War of 1913, and had been forced to back down both times by the threat of German intervention. So when conflict broke out in the Balkans again in 1914, in fear of losing all credibility, Russia refused to be humiliated yet again, and the Russian mobilization of 1914 thus made it the first of the big alliance partners to mobilize for World War I, provoking German mobilization and the implementation of the Schlieffen Plan, the massive invasion of Western Europe. In Germany, Prussia's reforms following its defeat by Napoleon had made it even more ambitious, especially its so-called Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck's goal was the unification of the various kingdoms and principalities of the former Holy Roman Empire into a modern German state, led by Prussia. Bismarck was an advocate of what he called Realpolitik, the politics of realism and practicality detached from ideology or wish. What would work? Bismarck's approach served him well. To unite the disparate German provinces and kingdoms would require him to go to war with his neighbors, but he hoped to limit the fighting in a way that would allow him to consolidate his gains and not lead to ongoing continuous warfare with his neighbors. It was a fine line to walk. The first two wars of German unification against Denmark in 1864 and Austria in 1866 were indeed fought this way, with Bismarck gaining the desired territory without creating long-term hostilities or insurgencies. However, the Third War of German unification against France was different. Prussia very much fought this war with an eye towards diminishing and humiliating France as much as possible. Even in the way it started, Bismarck took a telegram he received from France and edited it to make France look bad, then released it to the world, infuriating France. As Bismarck noted, the release of the edited telegram was like waving a red flag in front of the Gallic bull. Nonetheless, Bismarck had cause for concern. The French army was the largest army in Europe, well equipped and competently led. On the eve of the Franco-Prussian War, the French war plan called for three wings of the French army to attack in concert, with local commanders having the autonomy to react to changing battlefield conditions in real time. This makes what happened next even stranger. On the eve of the decisive Battle of Sedan, Emperor Napoleon III suddenly changed his army's disposition from three wings under local control to one giant army under his personal control. In an age before radio, controlling such a force in a quickly moving, dynamic battle was functionally impossible, and this was made exquisitely clear when the Prussians crushed the French at Sedan so completely that they captured Napoleon III himself. The differences between the Franco-Prussian War and the other wars of German unification now became clear. Before, Bismarck had gone to a great deal of trouble to ensure minimal future conflict with his neighbors. In France, by contrast, Prussian troops marched into Paris and occupied the city, and then Bismarck had his final triumph, the crowning of his sovereign Wilhelm I as the Kaiser of the German Empire. Compounding the insult to France, the investiture of Wilhelm was held in the Palace of Versailles, in the famed Hall of Mirrors. There is no greater symbol of French national pride and power than Versailles, and few greater national insults possible than for Versailles to serve as the venue for the German humiliation of France. The fragments and remains of the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire, had re-emerged as the Second Reich, the German Empire, and almost overnight it had emerged as the strongest power in Europe. The fall of Napoleon III had another profound effect. In previous years, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 had left Italy under the control of Austria. Resistance to Austrian domination bred unity, a unity that was furthered by revolutionary activity in 1830 and especially by the revolutions of 1848, the so-called springtime of the peoples. Breakaway republics began to form, and within a few years, four independent Italian states had independent constitutions. Led by Charles Albert of Sardinia, the Italians went to war against Austria in the First War of Italian Independence in 1848. Albert's revolutionaries were defeated, but Albert would be back, renewing the war in 1849. Defeated again, Charles Albert abdicated his throne in favor of his son, Victor Emmanuel II, the future king of a united Italy. Napoleon III of France, seeking to weaken Austria, had supported Italian unification efforts and finally openly defeated Austria in the Second War of Italian Independence. However, Napoleon III also defended the Papal States of central Italy against the Italians, and it was the loss of French support that came with Napoleon III's defeat by the Prussians and his capture that thus ultimately paved the way for the final unification of Italy, following the capture of Rome in 1871.